Glory Cloud Podcast, episode number 10. Well, welcome back, everyone. We're about to discuss one of Meredith Kline's books, so stay tuned. Well, welcome back to another episode of the Glory Cloud Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Cahy, and I'm joined by our co-host, Charles Lee Irons. Welcome back, Lee.
Hello, Chris. Great to be back with you.
I'd like to welcome our listening audience back as well. If you would like to comment on the episode or check out the show notes with the links to other resources, you can always go to the show notes page at meredithkline.com/podcast. And there you can find opportunities to put your comments in. You can download resources. You can click through to other web pages that we've linked to. And, of course, you can always get in touch with us at the show email, which is glorycloudpodcast@gmail.com. And you can leave us voicemail on Skype at CCAUGHEY. Well, Lee, I'm excited to talk about one of Kline's books this week. What have you got for us?
Well, today we want to talk about Treaty of the Great King. This was a book published, actually the first book that Meredith Kline published in 1963. The subtitle of the book is The Covenant Structure of Deuteronomy. So in this book, Kline is trying to use the ancient Near Eastern Suzerain Vassal-Treaties as a model to help understand the structure of the book of Deuteronomy.
Okay.
And probably it would be helpful, I think, Chris, to just sort of go back and give a little bit of background about the state of Old Testament scholarship at the time. So Kline is writing in the early 1960s. Actually, the book is divided into two parts. The first part is a reprinting of two articles that appeared in the Westminster Theological Journal in 1960. And then part two is a verse-by-verse commentary, but fairly brief comments on the book of Deuteronomy that was originally published in the Wycliffe Bible Commentary in 1962. But just to give some of the background of what was going on in Old Testament scholarship in the 1950s and 60s is that the archaeologists and scholars had begun to discover and publish and analyze some of the ancient Near Eastern Suzerain Vassal-Treaties. The first ones that were discovered by archaeologists were discovered in Turkey in around the year 1906 and following. And so they were looking at these Hittite treaties. And they discovered these Hittite treaties from the Hittite Empire, which had reached its peak around 1300 BC, so the middle of the second millennium BC. So these treaties then are pretty close to being contemporary with the writing of the Pentateuch, assuming Mosaic authorship. And that's part of the issue that Kline is trying to address here in this book. There's also some other scholars that need to be mentioned. For example, there is a scholar named Korosec. Kline mentions his name on page 14 in footnote 3. Korosec published the Hittite treaties in 1931. So although the Hittite treaties were discovered at the turn of the century in the early 1900s, they weren't published until a little bit later. And then it took time for scholars in the 1930s and 40s and 50s to analyze them and to begin to see their relevance for Old Testament studies. Probably the most important scholar was George Mendenhall. He wrote a book called Law and Covenant in Israel and the Ancient Near East in 1955. And Kline mentions him as well in this book. And I'm not 100% sure, but I get the sense that Kline was first introduced to this whole issue of the Hittite treaties through reading that book by George Mendenhall. He does mention an article by Mendenhall in 1954 that covers some of the same material that was republished in the book in 1955. He mentions the book as well. This is all at the very beginning on page 13, footnote 2 of Treaty of the Great King.
Okay.
By the way, George Mendenhall just recently passed away. I just found out recently that he passed away this summer. And he was, that was his claim to fame. That was the main thing that he was known for, was drawing out the parallels between these Hittite treaties and God's covenant or covenants with Israel. There's also another scholar named D.J. Wiseman, who was an evangelical Old Testament scholar. He also wrote a book that may have influenced Kline, titled The Vassal-Treaties of Esarhaddon in 1958. And this is a different set of treaties, not the Hittite treaties from the second millennium BC, but the Assyrian treaties from a little bit later in the first millennium. But there are also a lot of similarities there too. And so Kline seemed to have been interacting with these scholars, primarily Mendenhall and Wiseman. And he mentions Wiseman a couple of times in the footnotes, and seems to be sort of taking some of his inspiration from some of the things that Wiseman was saying as well. So the upshot then is that Kline is saying that he sees, quote, a remarkable resemblance, end quote, between God's covenant with Israel at Sinai and these ancient Near Eastern, whether Hittite or Assyrian, suzerain vassal treaties. Now you might be wondering, what do we mean by a suzerain and a vassal?
Good question.
Yeah. So a vassal, that might be a little bit easier. I think we kind of know what that is. A vassal is someone who is in a subordinate position of servitude. A suzerain is the one who's in the position of overlordship. But the specific issue here is that these are both kings. So there's a great king who has lordship over a lesser king. The lesser king is therefore also called sometimes a vassal king. The suzerain is the king who has conquered and is now entering into a relationship of covenant with the lesser king, who is now subordinate to the great king and is obligated then to, raise an army to support the great king. If he's attacked by his enemies, he's required to pay a certain amount of tribute every year to the great king, a certain number of talents of gold and silver and so on. He's got to be loyal to the great king. And so the treaty or the covenant is the document that defines the relationship between the great king and the lesser king, between the suzerain and the vassal. So that's what we're looking at here is these Hittite treaties where Hittite kings are, they're extending their empire and they are entering into treaties with these lesser kings that they conquered. And so there's a lot of interesting parallels between the literary structure of those treaties and God's covenant with Israel.
And it's particularly that covenant with Israel that Kline is looking at, correct?
Yeah, so a minute ago I said God's covenant or covenants with Israel. And so I think we need to be clear here. He's primarily, in this book here, Treaty of the Great King, he's primarily talking about the covenant that God made with Israel at Mount Sinai, but as renewed on the plains of Moab just before Moses dies and hands over the reins to Joshua. So really, the covenant that's being dealt with here in this book is the Deuteronomic renewal of the Sinai covenant. The Sinai covenant was established in Exodus 19 through 24, but it gets renewed multiple times throughout the Old Testament. The first renewal is in Deuteronomy. There's another renewal in Joshua 24 after Joshua brings Israel into the land and before he is gathered to his fathers, just like Moses was. And so this is a covenant renewal ceremony in Deuteronomy that has a lot of parallels and resemblances to the initial covenant transaction at Mount Sinai. I mean, even the Ten Commandments, right?
Right.
Yeah, Deuteronomy 5 is almost a verbatim repetition. Not exactly. There are some differences in the fourth commandment, but primarily, in the substance of it, it's a repetition of the Decalogue given at Mount Sinai initially.
Okay.
So the thesis of this book is, Kline states it on page 28. He says, the thesis is this: the position to be advocated here is that Deuteronomy is a covenant renewal document which in its total structure exhibits the classic legal form of the Suzerain treaties of the Mosaic Age. So its key points are: one, it's a renewal document; number two, it exhibits literary parallels to the Suzerain treaties of the Mosaic Age, that is, of the second part of the second millennium BC.
Okay. Let's talk about what some of those literary parallels might be. Okay.
Well, very simply, there are 5 sections to these suzerain vassal treaties that Kline sees as being the structure of the book of Deuteronomy. So the first element of the suzerain vassal treaty is the Preamble. And the Preamble is where the great king, the suzerain, identifies who he is and gives a list of all of his great names and all of his glorious identity, and he's the one who's in charge. He's the one who is making this covenant, and so he starts off with identifying himself. Now, in Deuteronomy, Kline sees the very first paragraph of the book of Deuteronomy chapter 1, verses 1 through 5, as parallel to the suzerain vassal treaty Preamble. And you might say, if you look at that paragraph, you might say, I don't really see how this is a strict parallel, because Deuteronomy 1 does not begin with Yahweh identifying himself directly. It's not quite the same as, for example, in the Decalogue, I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. That's a pretty good example of a preamble. But Deuteronomy doesn't seem to have that. It just says these are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel beyond the Jordan in the wilderness. But Kline is arguing that Moses here is God's vicegerent. That is, he's representing God. And so the identification of Moses at the beginning, these are the words that Moses spoke, is another way of saying these are the words of Yahweh being spoken through his vicegerent Moses.
Now, do you think that has anything to do with the fact that this is a renewal of the covenant from Exodus 20?
It could very well be. Yeah, that's a good possibility. You also have the fact that as soon as you finish that paragraph, it says, verse 5, beyond the Jordan in the land of Moab, Moses undertook to explain this law, saying, the Lord our God said to us in Horeb. So there you do have a reference to Yahweh himself in verse 6. So that's the first section, the preamble. The second major section of the Suzerain Vassal Treaty format is the Historical Prologue. And the Historical Prologue is it's a way for the suzerain to recount to the vassal the recent history leading up to this present point where the new covenant is being, this covenant relationship is being established. So, and oftentimes these covenants are, like you just said, they are renewals of previous covenants. So a renewal covenant will often just pick up the history from the last covenant and not go all the way back to the beginning. And that's what we have here in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 6, all the way through the end of Deuteronomy chapter 4, where Moses recounts the recent history, focusing on things such as the event that happened at Kadesh Barnea when Israel murmured and refused to go into the land because they're afraid of the tall giants living there, the Anakim, and the punishment that God sent to Israel for their rebellion, with the exception of Caleb and Joshua, I believe it was. I don't remember now. But they were the ones that were positive and wanted to encourage the people to go up to the land. You have a whole recounting of the wilderness wanderings and some of the initial battles that they had when they fought against the king of Sihon and the King Og and so on. So all this is the recent history, bringing the history of God's covenant dealings with Israel from Sinai up until this point here, where 40 years later, Israel is on the verge of entering into the land under Joshua. So that's the second major point of the outline, the historical prologue. The third point, the third literary section of the Suzerain Vassal Treaty is just the stipulations. That is, here are all the things that the vassal must do in order to be loyal to the suzerain. And here we have the bulk of the book of Deuteronomy, chapters 5 through 26. Kline does see, though, a breakdown within that. He sees chapters 5 through 11 as focusing on the primary stipulation of the covenant, which is what? It's you have to be loyal to the suzerain. You have to be loyal to Yahweh alone. So Deuteronomy 5 through 11 is really a series of sermons. I mean, it begins with the Ten Commandments, the Decalogue, but it continues into chapter 6 and 7 with Moses preaching to Israel and commanding them to be faithful, to be loyal. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might, and so on and so forth. This is the highest commandment of the covenant, that is to love Yahweh alone and not to worship other gods, and not to be disloyal to Yahweh by allowing yourself to be captivated by the idolatry of the Canaanites and the nations around them. So the stipulation section, the third major section, is the biggest section, but it's subdivided into the 5 through 11 on the primary stipulation of exclusive loyalty, and then 12 through 26 Deuteronomy, focusing on more specific stipulations of the covenant that get into details, such as the distinction between clean and unclean food, some of the annual festivals of Israel, the issues pertaining to justice, laws pertaining to the king, although the king hasn't been set up yet, but God is already anticipating that one day they will have a king in Deuteronomy 17, laws for the cities of refuge, and so on and so forth. So there's a long section there of 12 through 26 dealing with specific commandments and laws and stipulations, climaxing in Deuteronomy 26 on the offerings pertaining to the first fruits and the tithes. So that's the third major section, the stipulations of the covenant. And then you have the fourth major section, beginning in Deuteronomy 27 and continuing through 28, 29, and 30, which deals with the curses of the covenant, or the sanctions of the covenant, the blessings and the curses. So Deuteronomy 26 was the last chapter of the stipulations dealing with the first fruits, but then Deuteronomy 27 and 28 deals with the blessings and the curses from Mount Ebal, the blessings from Mount Gerizim, and the description there of the blessings and the curses is directly related to the issue of the bringing in of the first fruits and the tithes, because part of the issue is that Israel is going to fail to do that, and they're going to then be sent into exile because of their disobedience. So chapter 6 is kind of a nice segue into chapter 27 and 28. Then in the fifth section, now the fifth section is interesting. The fifth section typically in other presentations of the treaty structure, Kline would say that the fifth section is the documentary section. That is, it's the section dealing with, okay, now what's going to happen with this document that contains the covenant? And so there'll be these things saying, for example, anyone who adds or takes away from the words of this covenant will be under a curse, and a copy is to be, placed in the sanctuary of God, and so on. But in this case, in Deuteronomy, Kline departs from that and focuses what he focuses on the idea of dynastic succession. So that's Deuteronomy 31 to the end, to 34. And this contains basically this section of Deuteronomy is focused on a couple of things. First of all is the issue of who is going to succeed Moses. And so you start with Deuteronomy 31, and you have right away Moses is going to summon Joshua before all Israel, and he's going to tell him that he is now the one that's responsible for taking over this role that Moses had of leading Israel and being the covenant mediator. And he's the one that's going to lead Israel into the land and give them the inheritance. And so Joshua is basically ordained and commissioned by Moses to be the new leader for Israel. So this is where Kline gets the idea of dynastic succession. Now you might say, that sounds a little bit odd. That sounds like a dynasty of kings, right? Like
right.
David having a dynasty and then passing on the torch to Solomon. Well, yeah, in a sense, that's what Kline is suggesting. He's suggesting that in a way, it's only an analogy. It's not literally the case. Moses is not literally a king, and Joshua is not literally a king in that technical sense of what we think of as the Davidic king. But he's saying there is a kingly analogy there that Moses is providing for a dynastic succession, with Joshua being the one who takes over that leadership position in Israel. So that's an interesting point that he makes. And then the rest of that whole section in Deuteronomy 32, you have the Song of Moses, which looks ahead to how Israel is going to fail to keep the covenant. You have Moses giving the final blessings to all of the tribal leaders, and then you have the death of Moses. So that whole section then he summarizes under this concept of dynastic succession.
Okay.
So those are the 5 points: the preamble, the historical prologue, the stipulations, the sanctions, that is the blessings and the curses, and then either the documentary clause, or in this case, substituting for that, dynastic succession. Actually, those two things seem to be sort of related in a way, because the documentary clause is similar to dynastic succession in the sense that you're dealing with the future. You're saying, okay, now that the covenant's in place, what's going to happen to it from now on? And so the documentary clause is related to this idea of succession. Even Joshua himself, right? He's going to be renewing the covenant later on in the book of Joshua. It's recorded how he does that, and so he himself is embodying and carrying on the covenant as if he is the document, as if he's continuing it on, carrying it on after Moses' death.
Right. That's helpful to point out that whether it is the documentary clause from the Hittite treaties or this dynastic succession, that either way you're looking at how this covenant is going to survive into the future.
Right. Because that's what a covenant is about. A covenant is a way of ensuring for a history. It looks back to the history up to that point, the historical prologue, but then it looks forward into the history to come and says, this is what's going to happen. If you obey, you'll be blessed. If you disobey, you'll be cursed. And even beyond that, even Moses as a prophet looks beyond the curses to the point when Israel is in exile and they return to the Lord, and God makes a new covenant with them. And so Deuteronomy 30, which anticipates the new covenant, is looking far into the future, looking all the way down to the Messianic age, looking to the exile, beyond the exile, to the post-exilic period, and down to the coming of the Messiah and the establishment of the new covenant. In Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 1 through 10, that great section, that's the one that Paul quotes in Romans 10, when he says that that they're going to be restored and that there's going to be a new covenant. So, yeah, he quotes Deuteronomy 30, verses 11 through 13. You know,
in Romans,
he said,
10.
Yeah, in Romans 10, he quotes the part where it says, "Don't say, who will ascend to heaven for us and bring it to us that we may hear it and do it? Neither is it beyond the sea that you should say, who will go over the sea for us and bring it to us that we may hear it and do it? But the word is very near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart." And so Paul interprets that as not the law, but as the gospel, the word of faith. And so he's already interpreting this whole section here Christologically and in terms of the new covenant. So my point is that a covenant is, by definition, it is a way of creating a history of a relationship between two parties. And so it naturally envisions history, and therefore it has to do with this idea of what's going to happen to the covenant in the future, what's going to happen to this relationship in the future. So let's just go ahead and look at some of the key things in this book here. So as I mentioned, the book has two parts. Part one is on the treaty form of the Decalogue and how it relates to Deuteronomy. And this is the republication of those two articles from the Westminster Theological Journal. Article 1 is called The Two Tables of the Covenant, and the second article is called Dynastic Covenant. I would like to look a little bit more at that first one, the two tables of the covenant. So this is the famous article, and now it's a chapter in this book, where Kline argues that when it talks about the two tables of the law or the covenant, that it's not referring to the first table being what is our duty towards God, and then the second table being what is our duty towards man, with the first table being the first 4 commandments, and then the second table being the last 6 commandments. That's a pretty fairly traditional interpretation of what the two tables are referring to. But it's even mentioned in the Westminster Confession and interpreted that way. But Kline takes a different take on that. He quotes Deuteronomy 4:13, "And he declared unto you his covenant, which he commanded you to perform, even 10 commandments, and he wrote them on 2 tables of stone." That's the very beginning of this article or chapter, and he's saying, look, that traditional interpretation is in need of correction in light of our new understanding of the literary parallels and he calls remarkable resemblance between God's covenant with Israel and these vassal treaties. Because in these vassal treaties, when it talks about the documentary clause, the issue was not dividing the commands or stipulations into 2 sections and saying one section has to do with loyalty to the suzerain, and the other section has to do with the vassal's relationships with his fellow vassals. Rather, the issue of the documentary clause had to do with taking one copy of the covenant and depositing it in the sanctuary of the suzerain, and taking the other copy and placing it in the sanctuary of the vassal. And so Kline argues then that the correct interpretation is that both tables are complete, that they contain the entire 10 commandments, and that because Yahweh's relationship with Israel is not a polytheistic relationship, because Yahweh is the only true God, both copies of this covenant, unlike the pagan treaties, both copies are to be placed in the Ark of the Covenant. Now, why is that important? It may seem like a minor thing. Okay, so fine, instead of taking the 2 tables as commandments 1 through 4 and then commandments 5 through 10. Now we just say all 1 through 10 are repeated, and so you have 2 copies of one covenant. But why is it important? Well, it's important because of what Kline draws out from it on page 17. He says that the key issue here is analyzing what is it that we're looking at here. When we're looking at the Decalogue in Exodus 20 or Deuteronomy 5 in the renewal form of it, are we looking at a corpus of law, such as, for example, in the Code of Hammurabi? Or are we looking at a covenant? And Kline is arguing that it is law, but that's not the fundamental genre of it. What it is it's covenant. And the laws are stipulations of a covenant. And so on page 17, he says, the 2 stone tablets are not therefore to be likened to a stele containing one of the half dozen or so known legal codes earlier than or roughly contemporary with Moses, as though God had engraved on these tables a corpus of law. So, and then he has a footnote referring to the Code of Hammurabi. Rather, the revelation they contain is nothing less than an epitome of the covenant granted by Yahweh, the sovereign Lord of heaven and earth, to his elect and redeemed servant Israel. So the genre of Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5 is not law. It's not a stele, a big stone pillar with all the laws written on them for all the people to see. It's not, the genre is not legal code. The genre is covenant. And so he says in page 17, not law, but covenant. And that really, I just would underline that. Not law, but covenant. And so that really gives you kind of a paradigm shift, I think, to see that when we're looking at the Sinai Decalogue, at the 10 Commandments, we're not looking at a list of commandments. We're looking at a covenant that has stipulations in it. Yes, there are commands, but the commands are stipulations of a covenant. And that then causes you to realize that what we're talking about here is not just abstract law, where you just have 10 eternally moral principles that just timelessly apply to all mankind in all ages, but rather you're looking at a covenant relationship between God, the suzerain, and Israel, the vassal, and these are the terms of this covenant. And you even have the preamble there at the beginning, I'm the Lord your God. You have the sanctions of the covenant scattered throughout, attached to several of the commandments. The second commandment has sanctions attached. The fourth commandment, the fifth commandment, honor your father and mother that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. And so this then is a covenant. And so what that means then is that God is not simply giving us timeless moral law. It may contain principles that do apply outside of Israel and even after Israel, but that's not what we're fundamentally looking at. What we're fundamentally looking at is the tablets of the covenant.
Right.
And Kline refers to a couple of passages in the book of Exodus and Deuteronomy that make that clear. For example, Exodus 31:18, the 2 tablets of the testimony. And the word testimony, he has a section in this in Treaty of the Great King where he explains what that word testimony means. It's just another term for a covenant, because what was the key thing about these ancient Near Eastern treaties? It was that they were made in the presence of and invoking the gods as witnesses. And so the 2 tablets of the testimony means the 2 tablets of the covenant that is being witnessed by, in this case, by Yahweh. And he's going to enforce the terms of the covenant. If Israel obeys, they'll be blessed. If they disobey, they'll be cursed. So the 2 tablets of the testimony then means the 2 tablets of the covenant being witnessed by or testified to by Yahweh. Also, there's Exodus 34:28, where it says Moses wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant. It doesn't say he wrote on the tablets the 10 commandments or the 10 words. It says he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant. And then later on in Deuteronomy 9:9, it says that Moses went up the mountain to receive the tablets of stone, the tablets of the covenant that the Lord made with Israel.
That's helpful. Now, Kline is not. Kline would not deny, and we are not denying in discussing this, that God's character is such that his moral will doesn't change for us, right?
Right, absolutely. So God's moral will is unchanging because it's rooted in his unchanging character of absolute holiness and justice. So anything in those 10 commandments that is part of the moral will of God, you're going to see those same moral principles applied in other covenants and in other epics, and not just with Israel, but also with the Gentiles. But you can't assume that just because it's in the 10 commandments, it's just because it's one of the stipulations of this covenant, that therefore it must be moral. Rather, you have to analyze it and say, now, what in here is moral, and what in here is part of the specific covenant that God is making with Israel?
Okay. So, in this quote from page 17, that this covenant in Deuteronomy, or I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. These commandments that we're reading in Deuteronomy are not fundamentally, in terms of their literary genre, they're not law, but they are covenant. Is that the kind of place that Kline would point to say something like law is not abstracted from covenant, but is always in the context of covenant?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And what would be the value of that observation for our listening audience? Why does it matter that law is never just abstract floating around disembodied, but is always embodied in covenant?
It matters because we as Christians, we're under the new covenant. We're not under the old covenant. We're not under the Sinai covenant. And so even though many of the individual stipulations of the Sinai covenant, such as, you shouldn't worship other gods, will continue over into the new covenant, they don't all continue over, and they don't all continue over in the same way. And so in the new covenant, when the law comes to us, it comes to us in a new covenant context, and the blessings and the curses are fulfilled by Christ. He took the curses for us on the cross, and he earned the blessings by his obedience to the law. It's not up to us to escape curse by trying to be law keepers and to earn blessing by trying to be law keepers. So the covenantal context of law will make a significant difference in the way you approach your law keeping.
Right.
Do we keep the law to earn God's favor? Absolutely not. We keep the law as a response to God's grace.
So the kind of covenant that we find commandments in makes all the difference.
Yeah, it makes a huge difference.
Yeah. I find that a very helpful observation. So thank you for talking about that.
And then it also affects your interpretation of specific commandments. So, for example, the fourth commandment. Is the fourth commandment an absolutely binding universal moral law, binding on all men in all ages, not just Israel, but also the Gentiles? Well, it could be, but we need to have more argumentation than just saying, well, it's listed in one of the 10 commandments, therefore it has to be eternally binding moral law. And, even those who would say that the fourth commandment is still binding in the new covenant era, they would still have to recognize, unless they're going to be Seventh-day Adventists, they would have to recognize that the fourth commandment has changed, at least in terms of the day in which the Sabbath is kept, from the seventh day of the week to the first day of the week.
That's right.
So if you were to take the fourth commandment and just assume that it's just eternally moral, binding, eternal law, and no covenantal context needs to be taken into consideration, then logically you would have to say that the Seventh-day Sabbatarians are correct.
Well, that sounds like an entire episode all by itself.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, so, Kline's own view of the Sabbath is something that we would like to talk about in a future episode, because his view of the Sabbath evolved over the years, but in terms of the fundamental hermeneutical principle that he's already laying out here as early as 1963, or really 1960, when he wrote the article, The Two Tables of the Covenant, he's saying that as a biblical theologian, when you interpret the Ten Commandments, you can't interpret it simply as moral law, simple, straightforward moral law. You have to interpret it as the stipulations of a covenant that God made with Israel. And that requires you then to do a little bit more hermeneutical adjusting and filtering before you can just apply it directly into the new covenant age without any change. So that's really to me, that of all the things in this book that stand out to me, that first chapter, the two tables of the covenant, really seems to me to be the most important part of this book. Of course, the detailed commentary where he gives verse by verse or paragraph by paragraph comments on each section of Deuteronomy, those are also very helpful. But in terms of providing you with some good biblical, theological, and covenantal thinking, I think that this very first chapter is the key to that.
An early lesson in how to read your Bible.
Mm-hmm. Now, another thing to keep in mind too, Chris, is that because this was Meredith Kline's first book, there are some aspects of the book that have to be interpreted in light of his later writings.
Okay.
Yeah, so this book here, his earliest one, still contains some of the influence of John Murray and his thinking. So John Murray would have been very strongly emphasizing that the Abrahamic covenant and the Sinai covenant are not distinct in kind, but are just simply different administrations of the same covenant of grace. And Kline would later, and not too long afterwards, because by 1968 and by oath consigned, he's already, that's only 5 years later, he's already making a very clear contrast between the Abrahamic and the Sinai covenant. But here in this book, that contrast, the contrast between Abraham, or the Abrahamic and the Sinai, or the law gospel contrast, is somewhat muted. You can see that, for example, on pages 22 and 23, where he says, he's actually critiquing Mendenhall. So remember Mendenhall, one of the scholars he's responding to, or who helped him to see the parallels between the Vassal-Treaties and the biblical covenant. He sees something in Mendenhall that he doesn't quite like. He says Mendenhall mistakenly regards the Abrahamic covenant as completely different in kind from the Sinaitic, partly because of God's oath and partly because of an alleged absence of obligations imposed on Abraham. And so Kline says he doesn't agree with that. He doesn't think that it's completely different in kind. But then again, later on, 5 years later, he will see a stronger contrast between those two. But on the other hand, though, keep in mind that when Mendenhall says there's an absence of obligations imposed on Abraham, and Kline correctly responds to that and says, that's not true. Look at Genesis 12:1 and Genesis 17:1. Walk before me and be perfect. Mm-hmm. And so there were obligations imposed on Abraham. And that is something that even the later Kline, even in By Oath Consigned and Kingdom Prologue and so on, he's going to continue to emphasize that even the Abrahamic covenant does have obligations. And total allegiance to Yahweh is required of Abraham. Now, the difference is the nature of those obligations, just as we were saying before, right? In terms of the covenant context, is it a covenant of works, or is the obligation to obey a covenant of works where you obey in order to be blessed, and if you disobey, you'll be cursed? Or is the obligation to obey a response to the prior grace of God in which He sovereignly administers His grace to Abraham and guarantees it, and so the response of Abraham in his obedience to God is simply the evidence of his faith, showing that his faith in God in response to God's promises is a genuine faith. And so that's what Kline will argue, and he spells that out in great detail in Kingdom Prologue, that the obligations function within the Abrahamic covenant, not in the context of a covenant of works, but a covenant of grace.
Yeah, how those obligations function just makes so much difference.
Yeah, it makes a huge difference. If the obedience is the basis of receiving the blessing, then it's a covenant of works. That's merit. If the obedience is the response to receiving God's blessing, then that's a different situation. Now we're talking about a covenant of grace.
Yep.
So let's see here. So, also on page 129 of Treaty of the Great King, this is much later in the book. This is where he's dealing with the sanctions section of Deuteronomy. And here's a sentence or two that I think the later Kline would want to qualify. He says, there is essential continuity in God's covenant of redemption from Genesis through Revelation. Nevertheless, the successive administrations of that covenant, as it is repeatedly renewed by divine grace, are to be distinguished. The covenant in Moab renewed the covenant at Sinai. Okay, that's true.
Mm-hmm.
You would still agree with that. But then he says, which renewed the covenant with Abraham, comma, which renewed the covenant with Adam.
Not quite.
So that last part of the first two sentences he would agree with. He would agree that there's essential continuity from Genesis to Revelation. He would agree that within the successive administrations of that covenant, there are distinctions. But this last sentence here, the covenant of Moab renewed in Sinai, which renewed the covenant with Abraham, which renewed the covenant with Adam, that part I don't think he would agree with anymore.
No.
So now, but of course, when he says that the Abrahamic covenant renewed the covenant with Adam, he's not referring to the Adamic covenant of works. He's referring to the covenant made after the fall in Genesis 3:15.
Okay.
So he would, because he has parentheses, compare Genesis 3:15. So that last part, that the Abrahamic covenant renewed the covenant with Adam after the fall in Genesis 3:15, he would agree with. But the part about the Sinai covenant being a renewal of the covenant with Abraham, that's the part that he would question. And he would want to word that differently. He would still want to see a connection, because the Abrahamic covenant has two levels to it. The first level is that first level fulfillment of Israel in the land. The second level of fulfillment is what that pointed to, but that was simply a type of, which is the eschatological fulfillment in Christ, the new creation.
Mm-hmm.
So he would see a connection between the Abrahamic covenant and the Mosaic covenant. The Mosaic covenant then being an overlay in which that first level fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant in the land is then governed by a works principle. But what he would want to qualify is saying that the Mosaic covenant itself is a renewal of the Abrahamic covenant itself. He would want to distinguish those two covenants, because the covenant of works made with Israel at Sinai is fundamentally different from the covenant of grace that God made with Abraham.
Right.
The law-gospel contrast. So, when you get to by oath consigned, you see very clearly where he uses the Pauline parallels, the Pauline passages in Romans and Galatians, where Paul makes that contrast between the law and the promise, between the promise that God made with Abraham and the law that came 430 years later and was added on top of the law until the seed should come, to whom the promise referred. There's also another quote, too, on pages 38 and 39 that I would like to draw attention to. I have written in the margins, no. He basically, he's responding again to Mendenhall. Mendenhall seems to be holding to some kind of a law-gospel contrast, right? And he's critiquing that a little bit. And he says that what Mendenhall is looking at when he sees these two different types of covenants, the covenant with Abraham and also with David, so the Davidic covenant and the Abrahamic covenant, Mendenhall sees as being similar to each other, and then those are in contrast with the covenant with Israel at Sinai. Kline says that what Mendenhall, interprets as a conflict between covenants is, in the last analysis, simply the fundamental theological paradox of divine sovereignty and human responsibility, which confronts us in all divine human relationships. And so back then in 1963, he's saying that all covenants have a paradoxical combination of both divine sovereignty, grace, the monergistic side of God guaranteeing, but then also the human responsibility side, and the fact that we have to do something in order to receive the blessing, and there's still blessings and curses. And so here I see, a dangerous mixing of law and gospel that I think he himself would look back upon with some degree of chagrin.
Yes.
And on page 39, he says, nor, on the other hand, is the aspect of guaranteed blessing absent from the Deuteronomic covenant.
Yeah, he would repudiate that too.
Yeah, no, he would say, no, there's no guaranteed blessing in the Deuteronomic covenant. It's clearly blessings or curses. It's clearly, and the exile means that it's not guaranteed blessing in the Deuteronomic covenant. So I just bring these things up because, there may be those out there who want to try to put a certain spin and interpretation upon Kline's thinking, and they might try to go to this book to do that. And I just would like to caution people that, look, this is his very first book, and he's still coming out from under the shadow of John Murray. And so a lot of his formulations in this book are things that he would later want to seriously qualify. There might be some element of truth in what he's saying there. I think he himself would look back upon it and say, no, there is an element of truth there, that yes, human responsibility is present even in a covenant of grace, like with the Abrahamic covenant and the new covenant. But he would want to clarify that how that works is fundamentally different from the way it works in the Mosaic covenant or the Deuteronomic renewal of the Mosaic covenant. And yet, so there are these statements here and there that Kline himself would want to revise. But yet, it's really interesting. As you read it, you also see already the foreshadow. You almost see an eschatological intrusion, if I may say, of some of Kline's later thinking, where you can see that he's very influenced by Gerhardus Voss as well. He's not just influenced by Murray, he's also very influenced by Voss. So, for example, on page 127, when he's dealing with the blessings and the curses in Deuteronomy 26, in Deuteronomy 27 and 28, on page 127, he speaks of the. Oh, I'm sorry. No, it's. I'm quoting. I made a mistake here. I'm referring to page 127 of Voss's book, in Biblical Theology by Gerhardus Voss. Voss speaks of the symbolico-typical sphere of appropriateness of expression. When Voss is trying to explain the blessings and the curses of the Mosaic covenant, Voss says there's an element here of what we have to call the symbolico-typical sphere of appropriateness of expression. Now, the way Voss puts it is not quite as clear as the way Kline is going to put it later, where he's going to want to make that a very clear works principle. Mm-hmm. And Voss doesn't quite go that far. But Kline is definitely reading Voss, and he's definitely seeing this idea of how the blessings and the curses are typological. And that this whole issue of Israel being able to stay in the land because of their obedience and then being exiled because of their disobedience, that this has to do with something related to typology and the symbolism of that typology. And so, Voss will say it has to do with this idea of the appropriateness of expression, but Kline will want to clarify that a little bit and make it more of a works principle. But on pages 124 and 125, that's what I was looking for. So on pages 124 and 25 of Kline's book, Treaty of the Great King, when he's dealing with the blessings and the curses of Deuteronomy chapter 28, he has a paragraph here, bottom of page 124, where he's commenting specifically on the blessings. And I'll read it to you. He says, although Israel's inheritance and continued enjoyment of the promises was not a matter of legal merit. Okay, so that comment there might be something that he would later want to qualify a little bit. But he says there was a connection between the nation's corporate piety and prosperity. And that sounds like something that you do find in Kingdom Prologue.
Yes.
He says, for the Old Testament theocratic kingdom prefigured the consummate kingdom of God. That's a key Vossian insight. And that's where Kline is going to take that Vossian insight that the theocratic kingdom of Israel in the land is a prefiguration or a type of the consummate kingdom of God, the eschatological new creation fulfilled in Christ in the future. And so back to quoting then, so this consummate kingdom of God, in which righteousness and glory are united. Righteousness and glory are united. That's the key phrase. Who gets the glory? Only the righteous, right? You have to be righteous to get the glory, to get the blessings. Righteousness and glory are united together. Accordingly, to keep the typical prophetic picture clear, God allowed the Israelites to enjoy the blessings of the typical kingdom only as they, and especially their official representatives, i.e. the king, exhibited an appropriate measure of the righteousness of the kingdom.
Oh, yeah, you do hear Voss coming through there.
You hear Voss, right? And you also hear later Kline. He's going to take that same language and he's going to expand on it and clarify that it's based on the works principle. And that, therefore, there is a sense in which you can speak of merit, maybe not real merit, but typological merit operating in the theocratic kingdom of Israel. So even though here he says it's not a matter of legal merit and it really is appropriateness of expression or the appropriate measure, yet he's going to, I think what he's getting at here is the idea that it's not a strict one for one, because even in his later thinking, he's going to acknowledge that it's not as though, that as soon as the first Israelite commits the first sin, that the whole kingdom is removed and Israel's kicked out of the land. No, it's going to require a larger build-up, and there has to be, typological legibility. So he's gonna translate this language of appropriateness of expression into his language of typological legibility. But what I'm saying is that you already see here that you see this foretaste of his later thinking, and that you can see how it's rooted in and is really building upon the insights of Gerhardus Voss.
Right.
And there are even some things in here that you sort of get a sense that he's not really completely on board with John Murray, because on page 23, he says that these covenants, he's referring here to these suzerain vassal covenants, these covenants are sovereign administrations, not of blessing exclusively, but of curse and blessing, according to the vassal's deserts. That almost sounds like a direct contradiction of Murray, because Murray would say that the covenant of grace, or he would say that the definition of a covenant, forget about the covenant of grace, just the definition of a covenant is that it's a sovereign administration of grace and promise. And here he's saying, no, look at these suzerain vassal treaties. They're not exclusive administrations of blessing. There's also the curse there too.
Right.
Right? I mean, that's pretty clear. You look at Deuteronomy 28, there's curse there. You look at the suzerain vassal treaties, there's curse there. If the vassal fails to, yield the proper tribute to the king, if he is disloyal to the king and sides with the king's enemies, then there's all these curses listed off. May the ravens come and pluck out your eye, and may your wife be barren, and may your children be destroyed, and on and on. The curses are heavily emphasized in these vassal treaties, both the secular and in the biblical. And so Kline is looking at that, and it's already pushing him to dissent from Murray, who defined covenant as simply blessing. That's it. It's just blessing. There's no curses there. He's saying you can't get away with that. The text just won't let you.
Right.
There's obviously cursing there as well. And so this indicates then, it creates the beginnings of the distinction between the law and the gospel, between covenants of works and covenants of promise, between covenants of conditionality, where the blessing and the curse is conditioned upon obedience or disobedience, and curses that are unconditional, at least in the sense of how the blessings are given. The blessings are unconditional because they are not conditioned upon obedience. Now, there is a sense in which even a covenant of grace is conditional, because we still have to receive it by faith, and there still has to be the obedience as the fruit and evidence of faith. But that's a completely different type of conditionality than the meritorious conditionality of a covenant of works.
Exactly.
Yeah, so it's a good book. I encourage people to take a look at it, but just to keep in mind that you have to read this book in light of Kline's later writings, especially By Oath Consigned and Kingdom Prologue.
Yes, and what we've been discussing here towards the end about the law-gospel contrast being muted and some of the things that he said that he would later revise probably explains why when I asked him if I should go out and get Treaty of the Great King, he said, no, get the structure of biblical authority instead.
Interesting. Yeah, I heard similar things, that he wasn't, and that might be why Treaty of the Great King wasn't even republished again until I believe it was after his death, so I have a copy here that was republished by Whiff and Stock, and it says publication date 1/3/2012.
Oh.
I mean, originally it was published by Erdman's in 1963, but this republished version by Whiff and Stock was 2012. Almost 5 years after he died. So that might be the reason. Okay. He didn't want it to be published again while he was still alive. And also, just one quick thing, I think we need to wrap it up here, but one quick point is that for the listeners who would like to delve into more clearly what is this distinction between the way in which obedience functions within the context of a covenant of grace as opposed to a covenant of works, the place to go is Kingdom Prologue, and in his section on the Abrahamic covenant, so this is part 2 of the book, chapter 3 of part 2, titled The Kingdom Promised in the Abrahamic Covenant. That whole chapter is very important, but if you want to get right to this issue, go to page 302, section B, Divine Promise and Divine Sovereignty. And then he starts talking about this issue of divine sovereignty, and then section C, Sovereign Grace and Human Obligation. And he makes the distinction there between the different types of conditionality. He talks about the circumcision aspect, the fact that there's that threat in Genesis 17 that the individual who is not circumcised will be cut off from the covenant. How does that threat fit into a covenant of grace? He explains that. And then on page 318, the section called Compatibility of Promise and Obligation. That's a very important section. So basically from 302 to 320 of Kingdom Prologue, he really gets into the weeds here of the different types of conditionality. There's the conditionality that simply is the confirmation that your faith is genuine, and there's the conditionality that is incompatible with grace because it's the conditionality of a covenant of works.
He's so clear and helpful there.
Yeah.
Kingdom Prologue can be hard work, but I want to encourage you to do that work because it'll pay dividends for your reading of the Bible.
Yeah, absolutely. And Kline is so clear on this.
Yes.
And it's just so helpful. So, yeah, and it's so confusing when people aren't clear on it, and especially when not only when theologians aren't clear on how evangelical obedience fits into the context of justification by faith alone and into the context of the new covenant. But not just theologians, when pastors aren't clear on it, when they teach the imperatives of Scripture in such a way that they're confusing the people and they're making it seem as if you got to do this stuff in order to at least keep God's favor, or maybe to somehow, they wouldn't use the word earn God's favor because they know that's wrong, but somehow the way it comes out in terms of how it trickles down to the people, at the end of the day, it turns into a functional legalism or neonomianism, where somehow there's something that I have to do in order to keep God's favor. And so he's very clear on making these distinctions that would be very helpful for preachers, especially for those that are feeding and shepherding the flock, to make sure that when they're preaching these passages, especially if they're preaching the Old Testament, right?
Yes.
Especially some of these texts in the Old Testament that sound pretty heavy, like Deuteronomy, right? If you're going to preach Deuteronomy, you got to be careful how you preach it and how you apply it to the people of God today in the New Covenant. You can't just simply bring it right over and say, oh, this is just directly what we're supposed to do, and this threat here is directly on you. No, you got to understand this covenant here in light of the whole flow of redemptive history, and you got to make the appropriate adjustments to see how it all gets transitioned and transferred and hermeneutically filtered through Christ, so that you don't put people under the law again as a yoke of bondage and a discouraging thing that undermines their assurance.
Right.
But at the same time, you can preach Deuteronomy, I think, to the New Covenant people of God. But you have to do it in a way that's sensitive to the transition in redemptive history, so that when you bring those applications, such as loyalty to Yahweh, for example, the primary thrust of the primary stipulation of the Deuteronomic covenant, yes, that can transfer over into the New Covenant, but you have to do it in a way that brings it into a New Covenant context, so that the people of God are not put under a yoke of bondage again.
Amen.
So go out, read that book.
Pick up a copy of Treaty of the Great King and learn from Kline about the parallels between the treaties that were common in the ancient Near East and the covenant that God made with Israel.
That's right.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us this week for the Glory Cloud podcast. Hope that you enjoyed talking about Treaty of the Great King, and we hope that you will join us again next week for another episode.